Before we descend into the darkness, I want to ask a favour. If you enjoy this story, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference. And if you'd like, comment what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. Now let's begin. The human mind expects language to behave in certain predictable ways. When we make a statement about the world, we assume it can be measured against reality and assigned a value, true or false. A sentence that says the sky is blue can be checked. A sentence that says water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius can be tested. The system feels stable because there is something outside the sentence, some fact, some condition in the world, that determines whether the claim holds up. Truth in this ordinary sense is a relationship between what we say and what is. The sentence points outward, and the world either confirms it or contradicts it. But there exists a sentence that does not point outward. It does not describe the sky or water or any object you could touch or measure. Instead, it turns inward and makes a claim about itself. The sentence is short, almost laughably simple. This statement is false. At first glance, it seems like a minor curiosity, a linguistic trick that might amuse someone for a moment before they move on. But the simplicity is deceptive. This sentence does not behave the way language is supposed to behave. It does not allow you to assign it a truth value and walk away. Instead, it creates a loop, a cycle of reasoning that tightens with every step. And no matter how carefully you approach it, the sentence refuses to settle into either category. It is not a failure of your thinking. It is not a lack of information. It is a structural problem embedded in the sentence itself, and it has troubled philosophers, logicians, and mathematicians for more than 2,000 years. The trouble begins with self-reference. Most sentences point at something else. They describe events, objects, properties, relationships. But this sentence points at itself. The subject of the claim is the claim. The statement is both the thing being evaluated and the tool doing the evaluation. That doubling creates a peculiar tension, because truth is normally a judgment. We apply from the outside. We stand apart from a sentence, compare it to the world, and decide whether it fits. But when a sentence folds back on itself, there is no outside position. You are inside the loop the moment you try to evaluate it. And the loop, as it turns out, has no exit. The paradox is often called the liar paradox, though the name is slightly misleading. There is no liar here, no person making a false claim with intent to deceive. The sentence is not about dishonesty, it is about structure. It is about what happens when language is allowed to reference itself in a particular way, combined with a claim about truth. The ancient Greeks were aware of this problem. Epimenides, a Cretan, is said to have declared that all Cretans are liars, and from that declaration, a version of the paradox emerged. But the clearest, simplest form strips away the cultural context and the human element. It removes the liar and leaves only the loop. This statement is false. 4 words, and the entire edifice of binary truth begins to wobble. Before we trace the reasoning that creates the paradox, it helps to understand what makes this sentence different from the vast majority of statements we encounter. Consider a typical declarative sentence. The cat is on the mat. This sentence has a subject, the cat, and it makes a claim about that subject's location. We can verify the claim by looking at the world. Is there a cat? Is there a mat? Is the cat positioned on the mat? The sentence reaches out into physical space and makes a testable assertion. The truth value depends on correspondence. Does the sentence match the facts? Now consider a sentence like snow is white. This is a general claim about a property of snow. We can test it by examining snow, observing its colour, and comparing that observation to the claim. Again, the sentence points outward. It describes something in the world, and the world either supports the description or contradicts it. The mechanism is straightforward. The sentence is a kind of map. and we check whether the map corresponds to the territory. Even abstract sentences follow this pattern in most cases. 7 plus 5 equals 12 makes a claim about mathematical relationships. We can verify it through calculation, through the axioms of arithmetic, through logical derivation. The sentence points to a mathematical truth, and we can confirm or deny it by examining the mathematical facts. The sentence has content that exists independently of the sentence itself. The number 12 does not depend on anyone saying 7 plus 5 equals 12. The claim is about something external to the claim. But this statement is false does not point outward. It does not describe cats, snow, numbers, or any external facts. It points at itself. The subject of the sentence is the sentence. The claim is about the claim, and that creates a fundamentally different situation. There is no external fact to check. There is no independent reality to consult. The sentence is asking you to evaluate it based on what it says about itself. And what it says about itself is that it is false. The content of the sentence is its own truth value, and that content is self-negating. This self-reference is the key. Without it, there is no paradox. A sentence like "my previous statement was false" can be evaluated if we know what the previous statement was. If the previous statement was "the sky is green," then "my previous statement was false" is true because the sky is not green. The sentence refers to another sentence, and we can break the reference chain by examining the external claim. But this statement is false, has no external reference. The chain loops back immediately. The sentence refers to itself, and only to itself, and that creates a closed circuit. It is worth pausing to appreciate how rare this is. The overwhelming majority of sentences we produce in daily life do not refer to themselves. They refer to objects, events, people, ideas, anything except the sentence itself. Self-reference requires a deliberate act of linguistic construction. You have to design a sentence that points back at itself, and you have to do so explicitly. This statement is false is a deliberately engineered expression. It is not something that arises naturally in conversation. It is a philosophical thought experiment, a test case, a probe designed to reveal something about the structure of truth. And what it reveals, at first contact, is that something is wrong. The sentence feels unstable. It resists evaluation. You can almost feel the logical ground shifting beneath your feet when you try to assign it a truth value. And that feeling is not an illusion. It is a signal that the ordinary rules are not working, that the framework is encountering something it was not designed to handle. Let us try the most natural move first. Suppose the sentence is true. This is the default instinct. Take the sentence at face value. Assume it is telling the truth, and see where that leads. If the sentence is true, then what it asserts must be the case. The sentence asserts that it is false. So if we accept that the sentence is true, we are also accepting that the sentence is false. The two conclusions sit side by side, and they are incompatible. A statement cannot be both true and false at the same time, not in the classical framework of logic. The assumption collapses immediately. The moment you grant the sentence the status of truth, it pulls that status away from itself. The mind completes the reasoning, arrives at the conclusion, and then realizes the conclusion contradicts the starting point. It is a kind of logical short circuit, a proof that undoes itself in the act of being proven. There is something almost hypnotic about this step. The reasoning is airtight. Each move follows from the last with perfect clarity. If true, then false. The implication is clean, undeniable, and yet the result is impossible. The feeling is not one of confusion exactly. It is more like watching a mechanism jam. The gears turn smoothly until they lock, and no amount of force will make them continue. You can see the path the logic took. You can follow every link in the chain, and still the chain leads nowhere that makes sense. The sentence seemed to promise a simple evaluation, true or false, but it delivered a contradiction instead. And contradictions, in classical logic, are not allowed. They are the sign that something has gone wrong. But what exactly has gone wrong here? The reasoning is valid. The sentence is grammatically correct. The rules of logic have been followed. And yet the outcome is unacceptable. Let us walk through this step more slowly, because the details matter. We begin with an assumption. The sentence is true. In classical logic, this is a legitimate starting point. We are allowed to assume something provisionally in order to see what follows. This is the basis of proof by contradiction, one of the most powerful tools in logical reasoning. We assume something, derive consequences, and if those consequences lead to a contradiction, we conclude that the assumption must be false. So we assume the sentence, "This statement is false," is true. Now we ask, what does this sentence claim? It claims that this statement is false. The phrase "this statement" refers to the sentence itself. So the sentence is claiming that it itself is false. If the sentence is true, then what it claims must be accurate. And what it claims is that it is false. Therefore, if the sentence is true, it is false. But this is a contradiction. A sentence cannot be both true and false. The law of non-contradiction, one of the foundational principles of classical logic, states that contradictory propositions cannot both be true at the same time. If P is true, then not P is false. If the sentence is true, it cannot also be false. So our assumption has led us to an impossible situation. We have derived a contradiction. In a normal proof by contradiction, this would be the end. We would conclude that our assumption was incorrect. If assuming P leads to a contradiction, then P must be false. So if assuming the sentence is true leads to a contradiction, we should conclude that the sentence is false. And that is exactly what we will try next. But already there is a sense of unease. The contradiction did not arise from some external fact or some additional premise. It arose from the sentence itself, from its own content. The sentence generated its own contradiction. And that is unusual. So we try again. Perhaps the mistake was in assuming the sentence was true. Let us take the opposite path. Suppose the sentence is false. This is the natural counterpoint, the other half of the binary choice. If the sentence is false, then what it claims is not the case. The sentence claims to be false. So if the sentence is false, then the claim, "this statement is false," is incorrect. But if that claim is incorrect, the sentence is not false. It must be true. And if it is true, we are back where we started. The assumption that the sentence is false leads, through the same clean logical steps, to the conclusion that the sentence is true. But we began by supposing it was false. The assumption has generated its own negation. The proof has eaten itself again, but from the opposite direction. Let us trace this path carefully as well. We assume the sentence is false. We ask, what does the sentence claim? It claims to be false. If the sentence is false, then its claim is incorrect. If the claim "this statement is false" is incorrect, then the statement is not false. If it is not false, and we are working within a binary framework where every statement is either true or false, then it must be true. So if the sentence is false, it is true. Again, a contradiction. We assumed the sentence was false, and we derived the conclusion that it is true. The assumption and the conclusion are incompatible. By the logic of proof by contradiction, we should reject the assumption. But we have now tried both assumptions. We assumed the sentence was true, and that led to a contradiction. We assumed the sentence was false, and that also led to a contradiction. Both paths are blocked. Neither assumption can hold. Now the loop is visible. True implies false. False implies true. The two paths mirror each other, and neither one can hold. Each assumption leads to a conclusion that contradicts the assumption. There is no stable ground. You cannot call the sentence true because calling it true makes it false. You cannot call it false because calling it false makes it true. The sentence oscillates, flipping between the two values without ever settling on one. It is not that we lack the information to decide. It is not that the sentence is vague or ambiguous. The sentence is perfectly clear. The problem is that the clarity produces a contradiction, and the contradiction is baked into the structure of the sentence itself. This oscillation is not a failure of reasoning. The logic is impeccable. Every step is valid. Every inference is justified. The problem is not with the reasoning process. The problem is with the sentence. The sentence has been constructed in such a way that it cannot be consistently evaluated within the classical framework. It is a sentence that the system cannot process without generating contradictions. And that is what makes it a paradox. A paradox, in the strict philosophical sense, is not just a puzzle or a riddle. It is a situation where reasonable assumptions and valid reasoning lead to an impossible conclusion. The assumptions seem innocent, the reasoning seems sound, and yet the result is unacceptable. Something has to give, either the assumptions, or the reasoning, or the framework itself. And in the case of the liar paradox, it is not immediately clear which one should give. The assumptions are minimal. We are simply trying to evaluate a sentence. The reasoning is standard. We are using the basic rules of logic. The framework is classical logic, which has been enormously successful in mathematics, science, and philosophy. And yet this simple sentence breaks it. This is where the paradox earns its power. It is not a trick or a sophistry. It is not a misuse of language or a confusion of terms. It is a genuine problem, a structural flaw that reveals something deep about the relationship between language, truth, and logic. The sentence, "This statement is false," is a kind of limit case, a configuration that the classical framework cannot handle. And the fact that such a configuration can exist, that it can be expressed in ordinary language using ordinary words, is significant. It means that the framework has boundaries. It means that not every sentence can be evaluated as true or false. It means that the concept of truth, which seems so basic and intuitive, is more delicate than it appears. To understand why this is so unsettling, it helps to consider what the classical framework assumes. Classical logic is built on a few foundational principles. One is the law of non-contradiction. No statement can be both true and false at the same time. Another is the law of excluded middle. Every statement is either true or false. There is no third option. These principles seem almost self-evident. They feel like the bedrock of rational thought. And yet the liar paradox appears to violate both of them. If we try to evaluate the sentence, we are forced to say it is both true and false, violating the law of non-contradiction. If we refuse to assign it either value, we violate the law of excluded middle. The paradox puts us in a position where we cannot uphold both laws simultaneously. This creates a kind of philosophical crisis. If the foundational principles of logic can be challenged by a single sentence, what does that say about logic itself? Is logic a universal framework, applicable to all statements, or does it have limits? Is truth a coherent concept, or does it break down in certain cases? These are not idle questions. They go to the heart of how we understand reasoning, knowledge, and reality. And the liar paradox forces us to confront them. The ancient Greeks were the first to grapple with this problem in a systematic way. The paradox is sometimes attributed to Epimenides of Crete, who supposedly said, "All Cretans are liars." If Epimenides is a Cretan, and all Cretans are liars, then his statement must be a lie. But if his statement is a lie, then not all Cretans are liars, which means his statement could be true. The structure is similar to the liar paradox, though slightly more complex because it involves a quantifier, all Cretans, and a cultural reference. The simpler form, "this statement is false," distills the paradox to its essence. The Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus, who lived in the 4th century BCE, is often credited with formulating the paradox in its clearest form. Eubulides was a member of the Megarian school, a group of philosophers interested in logic, semantics, and the nature of truth. The Megarians were known for their paradoxes, and Eubulides contributed several, including the Sorites paradox, the paradox of the heap, and the paradox of the horned man. But the liar paradox is perhaps his most famous legacy. It has survived for more than 2 millennia, and it remains a central problem in philosophy and logic. The Stoics, who came after the Megarians, also wrestled with the paradox. Chrysippus, one of the most important Stoic philosophers, is said to have written extensively on the liar, producing multiple treatises attempting to resolve it. None of these treatises have survived, so we do not know exactly what solutions he proposed. But the fact that he devoted so much attention to the paradox indicates how seriously it was taken. For the Stoics, logic was a crucial part of philosophy, a tool for understanding the world and living a good life. A paradox that threatened the foundations of logic was not a trivial matter. It was a genuine challenge that demanded a response. In the medieval period, the liar paradox was studied intensively by logicians in both the Islamic and Christian traditions. Arabic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna discussed the paradox and developed sophisticated theories of reference and truth to address it. In the Latin West, medieval logicians devoted enormous energy to what they called insolubles, paradoxes that seemed to resist solution. The liar paradox was the most famous insoluble, and entire treatises were written analysing its structure and proposing ways to resolve it. These medieval logicians developed intricate theories of supposition, which described the different ways terms could refer to things, and they used these theories to try to untangle the self-reference in the liar paradox. One medieval approach was to distinguish between different levels of reference. A term could refer to things in the world, or it could refer to other terms, or it could refer to itself. The liar paradox, according to this analysis, involved a term referring to itself in a problematic way. By carefully tracking the levels of reference and imposing restrictions on self-reference, some logicians hoped to block the paradox. This approach anticipated, in a rough way, the hierarchical solutions that would be developed in the 20th century. But despite centuries of effort, no consensus emerged. The paradox remained unresolved, a persistent thorn in the side of logic and semantics. Different philosophers proposed different solutions, but none was universally accepted. The paradox seemed to resist every attempt to domesticate it. It remained wild, untamed, a reminder that language and logic were more complex and more fragile than they appeared. In the modern period, the paradox took on new urgency because of developments in mathematics and logic. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mathematicians were attempting to place mathematics on a rigorous logical foundation. The goal was to show that all of mathematics could be derived from a small set of logical axioms, using purely logical rules of inference. This project, known as logicism, promised to eliminate doubt and ambiguity from mathematics. It would show that mathematical truths were logical truths, grounded in the unshakable bedrock of logic itself. But the project ran into problems. One of the most devastating was Russell's paradox, discovered by the British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell in 1901. Russell's paradox is closely related to the liar paradox, though it arises in the context of set theory rather than semantics. The paradox concerns the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then it should not, because it is the set of sets that do not contain themselves. If it does not, then it should, because it meets the criterion for membership. The structure is identical to the liar paradox, a self-referential definition that generates a contradiction. Russell's paradox was a crisis for logicism because it showed that naive set theory, the foundation on which mathematics was supposed to rest, was inconsistent. If the foundation was inconsistent, the entire edifice collapsed. Mathematics could not be grounded in logic if logic itself contained contradictions. The paradox forced mathematicians and logicians to rethink their approach. They had to develop more careful, more restrictive systems that avoided the paradoxes. This led to the development of axiomatic set theory, type theory, and other formal frameworks designed to block self-referential contradictions. The most influential response to these paradoxes came from Alfred Tarski, a Polish logician working in the mid-20th century. Tarski's insight was that the liar paradox arises from a confusion of levels. When we talk about the world, we use a language, call it the object language. When we talk about the object language, we use a different language, call it the meta-language. Truth is a predicate that belongs to the meta-language, not the object language. A sentence in the object language cannot make a claim about its own truth, because is true is a meta-language predicate. The liar sentence attempts to collapse this distinction. It tries to use a truth predicate within the object language to make a claim about a sentence in the object language. And that, according to Tarski, is illegitimate. Tarski's solution is to enforce a strict hierarchy of languages. At the bottom is the object language, which talks about the world. Above it is the first meta-language, which talks about the object language and contains the truth predicate for the object language. Above that is a second meta-language, which talks about the first meta-language and contains the truth predicate for the first meta-language, and so on in an infinite hierarchy. At each level, you can talk about the truth of sentences at the level below, but you cannot talk about the truth of sentences at your own level. This blocks the liar paradox, because the sentence, "this statement is false," cannot be formulated. To say, "this statement is false," you would need to use a truth predicate from your own level, but truth predicates only apply to lower levels. Tarski's hierarchy is elegant and powerful. It provides a clear, formal framework for talking about truth without generating paradoxes. And it has been enormously influential in logic and the philosophy of language. But it comes at a cost. The cost is that we lose the ability to talk about truth in a unified way. There is no single truth predicate that applies to all sentences. Instead, there are infinitely many truth predicates, one for each level of the hierarchy, and we cannot step outside the hierarchy to talk about truth in general. We are always at some level, talking about truth at lower levels, but never able to encompass the whole system. This feels unsatisfying to some philosophers. It seems to avoid the paradox rather than resolve it. The liar sentence is ruled out by fiat by a stipulation that sentences cannot refer to their own truth. But why should we accept that stipulation? Natural languages like English do allow sentences to refer to their own truth. We can say this sentence is in English, and there is no paradox. We can say this sentence is true, and while that sentence is odd, it does not generate a contradiction. The problem arises only when we combine self-reference with negation, as in, this sentence is false. So the restriction seems too broad. It rules out more than just the paradoxical cases. Moreover, the hierarchy feels artificial. In ordinary language, we do not carefully track levels and make sure we are using the right truth predicate for each level. We just talk about truth, and most of the time, everything works fine. The hierarchy is a formal device that works well in mathematical logic, but it does not seem to capture the way truth actually functions in natural language. And if the goal is to understand natural language, rather than to construct a formal system, the hierarchy may not be the right tool. Other philosophers have taken a different approach. Instead of ruling out the liar sentence as ill-formed, they accept it as a legitimate sentence, but deny that it must be either true or false. This requires abandoning the principle of bivalence, the principle that every statement is either true or false. If we allow a third option, such as neither true nor false, or indeterminate, or paradoxical, then the liar sentence can be assigned this third value, and the paradox dissolves. This approach is appealing in some ways. It allows us to keep the liar sentence as a meaningful expression while avoiding the contradiction. We do not have to rule it out as nonsense or impose an artificial hierarchy. We simply acknowledge that some sentences do not fit neatly into the true-false dichotomy. They occupy a kind of liminal space, and we need to expand our framework to accommodate them. But this approach also has costs. The principle of bivalence is deeply embedded in classical logic. Many of the rules of inference that we use depend on it. If we abandon bivalence, we have to revise those rules. We have to develop a many-valued logic, a system that can handle 3 or more truth values. And we have to decide how these new truth values interact with the old ones. If a sentence is neither true nor false, what happens when we negate it? What happens when we combine it with other sentences using and or? The answers are not obvious, and different many-valued logics give different answers. Moreover, it is not clear what it means for a sentence to be neither true nor false. In what sense does the liar sentence fail to be true or false? It is not vague, like John is tall, where the truth value might depend on how we define tall. It is not ambiguous, like I went to the bank, where the truth value might depend on which meaning of bank we have in mind. The liar sentence is perfectly clear and unambiguous. It is just contradictory. So what does it mean to assign it a third value? Is this a genuine metaphysical category, a real status that some sentences have? Or is it just a formal device, a way of labeling problematic sentences without actually explaining what is going on? These questions do not have easy answers, and that is part of what makes the liar paradox so fascinating and so difficult. It is not a problem that can be solved by a single decisive move. Every solution involves trade-offs. Every approach has strengths and weaknesses. The paradox is a kind of stress test that reveals the limits of our theories. It shows where different theories break down, where they make commitments that might be questioned. Some philosophers have explored an even more radical approach, paraconsistent logic. Paraconsistent logic is a system that allows contradictions without collapsing into triviality. In classical logic, if you accept both a statement and its negation, you can derive any conclusion at all. This is called the principle of explosion. From a contradiction, anything follows. If both P and not P are true, then you can prove Q, where Q is any arbitrary statement. This makes classical logic very intolerant of contradictions. A single contradiction infects the entire system, making it useless. But paraconsistent logic rejects the principle of explosion. It allows you to accept contradictions in a controlled way without everything collapsing. The liar sentence in a paraconsistent framework can be both true and false. The contradiction is real, but it is contained. It does not spread to other parts of the system. You can still reason consistently about most things, even while accepting that some sentences are contradictory. This sounds strange, perhaps even incoherent. How can something be both true and false? Does this not violate the law of non-contradiction, one of the most basic principles of logic? Paraconsistent logicians argue that the law of non-contradiction, like other logical principles, is not absolute. It is a default rule that holds in most cases, but it can be suspended in special cases, like the liar paradox. The contradiction is an exception, a localized anomaly that does not undermine the system as a whole. Paraconsistent logic has found applications in various areas, from computer science to legal reasoning to the philosophy of science. It provides a way to work with inconsistent information without giving up entirely. If you have a database that contains contradictory entries, paraconsistent logic allows you to query the database and get useful results, rather than having the entire system crash. If you have a scientific theory that makes contradictory predictions in certain edge cases, paraconsistent logic allows you to continue using the theory in other contexts while acknowledging the inconsistency. But paraconsistent logic is controversial. Many philosophers and logicians find it deeply counterintuitive. The idea that a statement can be both true and false seems to violate something fundamental about the nature of truth. Truth, they argue, is about correspondence with reality, and reality does not contain contradictions. A cat cannot be both on the mat and not on the mat at the same time, in the same place, in the same respect. So how can a sentence about the cat be both true and false? Defenders of paraconsistent logic respond that the liar paradox is not about cats or mats or any external reality. It is about language, about sentences that refer to themselves. And language, unlike physical reality, can generate contradictions. The contradictions do not reflect inconsistencies in the world. They reflect structural features of language and logic. Paraconsistent logic is a tool for managing those features without pretending they do not exist. Another response to the liar paradox is to deny that it involves a genuine statement at all. According to this view, the sentence, "This statement is false," is not a real proposition. It may look like a statement, it may have the grammatical form of a statement, but it does not succeed in saying anything. It is a kind of pseudo-statement, a linguistic construction that fails to express a complete thought. This is similar to Tarski's approach, but it does not rely on a hierarchy of languages. Instead, it relies on a more general principle. Not every grammatically correct sentence expresses a proposition. Some sentences are defective in a way that prevents them from being evaluated as true or false. This view has some intuitive appeal. When you try to evaluate the liar sentence, there is a sense in which you cannot quite get a grip on it. It slips away. It does not seem to have a stable content. And that might be because it does not have any content. It is a kind of linguistic illusion, a sentence that looks meaningful but is actually empty. The challenge for this view is to explain what makes a sentence meaningful. What is the difference between a genuine statement and a pseudo-statement? The liar sentence uses ordinary words in an ordinary structure. It is not gibberish. It is not a random string of sounds. It seems to mean something. And if it means something, why can it not be evaluated as true or false? The defenders of this view need to provide a principled account of meaningfulness that rules out the liar sentence while preserving other self-referential sentences that are clearly meaningful. Yet another approach is to focus on the pragmatics of language use rather than the semantics of truth. According to this view, the problem with the liar sentence is not that it cannot be assigned a truth value, but that using it involves a kind of pragmatic incoherence. When you assert a sentence, you're implicitly committing to its truth. But if you assert "this statement is false," you are committing to the claim that what you are asserting is false. That is a pragmatically incoherent speech act. It is like promising to break your promise or commanding someone not to obey your commands. The sentence might have a meaning, and it might even have a truth value, but the act of asserting it is self-defeating. This pragmatic approach shifts the focus from the sentence itself to the act of using the sentence. It treats the paradox as a problem about what we can coherently do with language, rather than a problem about what sentences can mean or what truth values they can have. And it suggests that the paradox might be resolved, or at least diffused, by paying more attention to the context of use, the intentions of speakers, and the norms of communication. Each of these approaches offers a different perspective on the liar paradox, and each reveals something about the underlying assumptions we make about language, truth, and logic. The paradox is a kind of mirror, reflecting back the structure of our conceptual frameworks. Different frameworks reflect differently, and by examining these reflections, we gain a deeper understanding of what the frameworks are and how they work. One of the remarkable things about the liar paradox is its persistence. Despite more than 2,000 years of analysis, despite the development of sophisticated logical and semantic theories, the paradox remains unresolved in any definitive sense. There is no single solution that all philosophers and logicians accept. Instead, there is a landscape of competing solutions, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, each reflecting different philosophical commitments. The paradox has not been defeated, it has been accommodated in various ways by various systems. But it remains a challenge, a test case, a puzzle that continues to generate new insights. This persistence is not a failure, it is a testament to the depth of the paradox. The liar paradox touches on fundamental issues that do not have simple answers. What is truth? What is meaning? What are the limits of logic? These are not questions that can be settled once and for all. They are questions that each generation of philosophers must grapple with anew, bringing new tools, new perspectives, new ideas. The liar paradox is a constant companion on this journey, a touchstone that helps us measure our progress and test our theories. The paradox also has implications beyond philosophy and logic. It connects to issues in linguistics, computer science, cognitive science, and even physics. In linguistics, the paradox raises questions about the structure of natural language and the limits of semantic theory. Can a theory of meaning handle self-referential sentences? Should it? In computer science, similar paradoxes arise in the context of self-referential programs and recursive definitions. A program that checks whether it will halt faces a paradox, analogous to the liar. In cognitive science, the paradox raises questions about how the mind represents self-referential thoughts. Can we think, this thought is false? What happens when we try? In physics, some interpretations of quantum mechanics involve self-referential measurements, where the act of observation affects what is being observed in ways that create loops reminiscent of the liar paradox. These connections suggest that the liar paradox is not an isolated curiosity. It is part of a broader pattern, a family of problems that arise whenever systems fold back on themselves. Self-reference is a powerful and ubiquitous feature of complex systems. It allows systems to represent themselves, to modify themselves, to reason about themselves. But it also creates the potential for paradox, and understanding how to manage that potential is crucial in many domains. In mathematics, self-reference has been both a problem and a tool. Gödel's incompleteness theorems, arguably the most important results in the foundations of mathematics, are based on a kind of self-reference. Gödel constructed a sentence that, in effect, says, this sentence is not provable in this system. If the sentence is provable, then what it says is false, which means it is not provable, a contradiction. If it is not provable, then what it says is true, which means the system is incomplete. There are true sentences it cannot prove. Gödel used this self-referential construction to show that any consistent formal system powerful enough to express arithmetic is incomplete. There are truths that the system cannot prove. Gödel's proof is a kind of cousin to the liar paradox. It uses self-reference to generate a result that is deeply surprising and profoundly important. But unlike the liar paradox, Gödel's result is not a contradiction. It is a demonstration of a limitation. The sentence, this sentence is not provable, does not create a paradox because provability and truth are not the same thing. A sentence can be true without being provable. So Gödel's sentence can consistently be true and unprovable. The paradox is avoided, but a remarkable consequence follows. Formal systems have inherent limits. This shows that self-reference, carefully managed, can be a source of insight rather than contradiction. The key is to distinguish between different properties and to avoid collapsing them into each other. Gödel distinguished between truth and provability. Tarski distinguished between different levels of language. These distinctions create space for self-reference to operate without generating paradoxes. But the liar paradox shows what happens when the distinctions are not maintained. When truth folds back on itself, without any separation, without any buffer. The result is a loop that cannot be resolved. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of truth itself. What is truth? This is one of the oldest and most central questions in philosophy, and the liar paradox puts pressure on almost every answer that has been proposed. If truth is correspondence with reality, then what reality does the liar sentence correspond to? It does not describe the world, it describes itself. If truth is coherence with other beliefs, then how do we evaluate a sentence that contradicts itself, no matter what we believe about it? If truth is whatever is useful or pragmatically successful, then what use can we make of a paradoxical sentence? The liar paradox does not fit comfortably into any of the standard theories of truth. It is a limit case that exposes the weaknesses of each theory. Some philosophers have concluded that truth is not a single, unified concept. There may be different kinds of truth, or truth may be context-dependent, or truth may be a family of related but distinct notions. The liar paradox, on this view, is a signal that we need a more nuanced, more flexible understanding of truth. We cannot assume that is true always means the same thing, or that it always functions in the same way. Sometimes truth is a matter of correspondence, sometimes coherence, sometimes pragmatic utility, and sometimes, in pathological cases like the liar, truth simply does not apply. This pluralistic approach has its own challenges. If there are multiple kinds of truth, how do they relate to each other? Is there a core concept that unifies them? Or are they fundamentally different? And how do we know which kind of truth is relevant in a given context? Without clear answers to these questions, pluralism can seem more like an evasion than a solution. It avoids the hard work of defining truth by multiplying definitions. Yet there is something appealing about the idea that truth is more complex than it initially appears. Our everyday concept of truth is remarkably robust. We use it constantly in a wide variety of contexts, and it usually works well. But when we push it to its limits, when we test it with carefully constructed cases like the liar paradox, we discover that it has boundaries, that it is not as simple or as universal as we might have thought. And recognizing those boundaries is itself a form of progress. It is a deepening of understanding, a movement from naive confidence to reflective awareness. The liar paradox also invites us to think about the relationship between language and reality. Language is a tool we use to describe reality, to communicate about it, to reason about it. But language is also part of reality. Words are physical sounds, or marks, produced by physical processes in brains and bodies. Sentences are structured sequences of words governed by rules of grammar and semantics, and those rules allow for constructions that do not correspond to anything outside of language. Self-referential sentences are linguistic objects that refer to other linguistic objects, namely themselves. They are not about the world, they are about language, and that creates a kind of autonomy, a space where language operates according to its own rules, independent of external reality. This autonomy is powerful. It allows language to be creative, expressive, flexible. We can use language to talk about imaginary things, to tell stories, to formulate hypotheses, to explore possibilities. We are not limited to describing what is actually the case. We can describe what might be, what could be, what we hope or fear or imagine. Language transcends the immediate, the concrete, the actual. It gives us access to a realm of abstraction and possibility. But this autonomy also creates risks. If language can construct sentences that do not correspond to reality, it can construct sentences that cannot be evaluated by reference to reality. And if we then try to apply concepts like truth, which seem to depend on correspondence with reality, to those sentences, we run into problems. The liar paradox is an example of this risk. It is a sentence that language allows us to form, but that the concept of truth cannot handle. The autonomy of language has generated something that exceeds the capacity of our semantic frameworks. One way to respond to this is to impose limits on language, to restrict what sentences can be formed, to rule out self-referential constructions as illegitimate. This is the approach taken by Tarski's hierarchy and by various formal systems designed to avoid paradoxes. The idea is to bring language back under control, to ensure that every sentence can be evaluated, to prevent the autonomy of language from generating pathological cases. But another way to respond is to accept the autonomy of language and to recognize that not every sentence will fit neatly into our frameworks. Language is richer, more complex, more unpredictable than any formal system we can devise. And that is not a defect, it is a feature. It is part of what makes language such a powerful and versatile tool. The liar paradox. On this view, is not a problem to be solved, but a phenomenon to be understood. It is a reminder that language has its own logic, its own structure, its own possibilities, and those possibilities include configurations that challenge and surprise us. This tension between the desire for control and the recognition of autonomy runs through the entire history of responses to the liar paradox. Formal systems seek control. They want to specify exactly what sentences can be formed, exactly what they mean, exactly what truth values they have. Natural language, by contrast, is wild. It is unpredictable, creative, constantly evolving. It allows speakers to bend rules, to create new expressions, to use language in novel ways. And it allows for sentences like, "This statement is false," which break the neat frameworks we try to impose. Neither approach is clearly right or clearly wrong. Formal systems are essential for certain purposes, especially in mathematics and logic, where precision and consistency are paramount, but natural language is essential for other purposes, especially communication, storytelling, and thought, where flexibility and expressiveness are paramount. The liar paradox sits at the boundary between these two domains. It is a sentence that can be expressed in natural language, but that formal systems struggle to handle. It reveals the gap between the richness of natural language and the precision of formal logic. And it raises the question, should we try to close that gap, or should we accept it as an inevitable feature of the relationship between language and logic? The paradox also has a kind of aesthetic dimension. There is a beauty in its simplicity, an elegance in its structure. 4 words arranged in a particular way create a loop that has fascinated thinkers for millennia. The sentence is clean, minimal, stripped of all unnecessary elements. It is the pure distillation of a logical problem. And that purity gives it a kind of appeal, a charm, that is hard to resist. It is intellectually seductive. It invites you to engage with it, to try to solve it, to see if you can find the key that unlocks the paradox. And even when you discover that there is no simple key, that the paradox resists every attempt at resolution, there is a satisfaction in having grappled with it, in having traced the loops, in having seen the structure clearly. This aesthetic quality is not trivial. It is part of what makes the paradox endure. If it were merely a technical problem of interest only to specialists, it might have faded into obscurity. But because it's simple and elegant, because it can be appreciated by anyone who understands the concept of truth, it has remained alive, passed down from generation to generation, revisited and re-examined with each new wave of philosophical and logical inquiry. The paradox also serves a pedagogical function. It is an excellent teaching tool, a way to introduce students to the complexities of logic, language, and philosophy. It shows that even simple concepts can hide deep problems. It demonstrates the importance of careful reasoning, of paying attention to structure, of being willing to question assumptions. And it invites students to think for themselves, to engage with a problem that has no authoritative answer, to develop their own views and arguments. In this way, the liar paradox is not just a problem, but an opportunity, a gateway into philosophical thinking. For anyone encountering the paradox for the first time, there is often a moment of disorientation, a sense that something has gone wrong, but it is not clear what. The reasoning seems valid, the sentence seems meaningful, and yet the conclusion is impossible. That disorientation is valuable. It is a sign that the mind is encountering something genuinely new, something that does not fit existing patterns. And it is an invitation to think more deeply, to question assumptions, to explore alternatives. The paradox is a challenge, and challenges are how we learn and grow. There is also a playful quality to the paradox. It has a kind of trickster energy, a mischievousness. It lures you in with its simplicity, makes you think you can solve it easily, and then pulls the rug out from under you. It is frustrating, yes, but the frustration is part of the fun. It is like a magic trick where you know there must be a secret, but you cannot figure out what it is. And even when you learn that the secret is that there is no secret, that the paradox is genuinely paradoxical, there is a kind of delight in the realization. The mind enjoys being surprised, enjoys encountering things that exceed its grasp. This playfulness should not be mistaken for frivolity. The liar paradox is a serious problem with serious implications. But it is also a reminder that intellectual inquiry does not have to be dry or joyless. Thinking can be fun, puzzles can be engaging, and the search for understanding, even when it does not lead to definitive answers, can be deeply satisfying. The paradox also connects to broader cultural and intellectual themes. The idea of self-reference, of something turning back on itself, appears in many contexts beyond logic and language. In art, there are self-portraits, where the artist depicts themselves in the act of painting. In literature, there are stories about storytelling, where the narrative reflects on its own nature. In music, there are compositions that quote themselves, that build structures that fold back on their own beginnings. In film, there are movies that show the making of the movie, that break the fourth wall, that acknowledge their own status as fictions. All of these are forms of self-reference, and they all share something with the liar paradox. They create a loop, a folding back, a structure that points at itself. Self-reference is a way of stepping outside the usual flow, of creating a meta level, a perspective that looks down on the thing itself. And that perspective can be illuminating, can reveal structures and patterns that are invisible from inside, but it can also be destabilizing, can create ambiguities and paradoxes, can blur the boundaries between levels. The liar paradox is an extreme case where the destabilization is total, where the self-reference generates a contradiction that cannot be resolved. But it is part of a larger pattern, a broader fascination with loops and recursion and self-reflection. In mathematics, recursion is a fundamental concept. A recursive definition defines something in terms of itself. The factorial function, for instance, is defined recursively. The factorial of n is n times the factorial of n minus 1. This looks like a circular definition, but it works because there is a base case, the factorial of 0 is 1, that stops the recursion. Without the base case, the definition would loop forever, never reaching a definite value. The liar paradox is like a recursive definition without a base case. It refers to itself, but there is nothing to stop the loop, nothing to ground the reference. The recursion spirals endlessly, never settling. In computer science, recursion is a powerful programming technique, but it can also create problems. A recursive function that calls itself without a proper stopping condition will run forever, consuming resources until the system crashes. This is called infinite recursion, and it is a bug. Programmers have to be careful to ensure that recursive functions have base cases that the recursion eventually terminates. The liar paradox is like a program with infinite recursion. It loops endlessly, never reaching a stable state, never producing a usable output. These connections suggest that the liar paradox is not an isolated anomaly. It is an instance of a broader class of problems that arise whenever systems involve self-reference or recursion. Understanding the paradox can help us understand these other problems, and vice versa. The tools and techniques developed to handle the liar paradox, hierarchies, restrictions on self-reference, many-valued logics, para-consistent systems, can be adapted and applied in other domains. And insights from those other domains can be brought back to shed new light on the paradox. For instance, the concept of a strange loop, introduced by the cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter, is closely related to the liar paradox. A strange loop is a hierarchical system where by moving up or down through the levels, you eventually arrive back where you started. The Escher staircase that goes up and up but returns to its starting point is a strange loop. The video camera pointed at its own screen, creating an infinite regress of images, is a strange loop, and the liar sentence, which refers to itself in a way that creates an unresolvable oscillation, is a strange loop. Hofstadter argued that strange loops are central to consciousness, that the self is a strange loop, a system that represents and reflects on itself in a way that creates a kind of circularity. Whether or not that is correct, the concept highlights the importance of self-reference and the problems it can create. The liar paradox also appears in discussions of truth in religious and mystical contexts. Some traditions emphasize the limits of language, the idea that ultimate truths cannot be captured in words. The liar paradox can be seen as an illustration of this principle. It shows that language, when pushed to its limits, breaks down. It cannot capture every truth, cannot handle every configuration. There are things that slip through the net, that escape linguistic expression. This is not a defect of language, but a reflection of its nature. Language is a finite tool, and it cannot encompass the infinite. The liar paradox is a reminder of that finitude, a sign that points beyond language to something language cannot grasp. This perspective is different from the logical and philosophical approaches, but it is not entirely disconnected. It shares the recognition that the liar paradox reveals limits, boundaries, edges. Whether those edges are logical, linguistic, or metaphysical is a matter of interpretation. But the phenomenon is the same, a sentence that resists the frameworks we use to understand it, that points to something beyond those frameworks. In the quiet of contemplation, the liar paradox can be a kind of meditation object. Like a koan in Zen Buddhism, it is a puzzle that cannot be solved by ordinary reasoning. The more you think about it, the more it slips away, and that slipping away can be instructive. It can teach you about the limits of thought, about the places where logic ends and something else begins. It can cultivate a kind of intellectual humility, a recognition that not everything can be understood, that some mysteries remain. This meditative quality is part of what makes the liar paradox suitable for a sleep-friendly narration. It is a problem that does not demand urgency. There is no need to solve it tonight or ever. You can turn it over in your mind, trace the loops, appreciate the structure, and let it be. There is a calmness in that acceptance, a peace in recognizing that the paradox is what it is, that it will not change, that it does not need to be fixed. The loop continues, the oscillation persists, and that is fine. It is part of the landscape of thought, a feature of the terrain, something to be acknowledged and appreciated rather than eliminated. The paradox also invites us to think about the nature of problems themselves. What makes something a problem? Usually, we think of problems as obstacles to be overcome, challenges to be met, difficulties to be resolved. But the liar paradox is a different kind of problem. It is not a barrier to progress. It does not prevent us from doing anything important. It is more like a marker, a signpost that says, here is an edge, a boundary, a place where the usual rules do not apply. And recognizing that boundary Is itself valuable? It tells us something about the territory, about the structure of the conceptual landscape. It maps the limits of our frameworks. In this sense, the liar paradox is not a problem to be solved, but a feature to be understood. It is a permanent part of the logical landscape, a fixture that will always be there, no matter how much we refine our theories. And that permanence is not a failure. It is a success of a different kind. It is the success of having identified something real, something stable, something that persists across different frameworks and different approaches. The paradox is a touchstone, a reference point, a constant against which we can measure our theories. The history of philosophy is full of problems like this, problems that do not admit of definitive solutions, but that continue to generate insight and understanding. The problem of free will, the mind-body problem, the problem of induction, these are all questions that have been debated for centuries without resolution. And yet the debates have been enormously productive. They have led to new concepts, new arguments, new ways of thinking. The liar paradox is in this tradition. It is a problem that does not go away, but that continues to teach us, to challenge us, to deepen our understanding. There is also a kind of comfort in the fact that some problems are permanent. It means that there is always more to think about, always more to explore. The intellectual landscape is not a finite territory that can be fully mapped and exhausted. There are always edges, always frontiers, always mysteries. And the liar paradox is one of those mysteries. It is a reminder that thinking is an ongoing process, not a destination. There is no final theory, no ultimate framework, no end to inquiry. There is only the journey, the exploration, the perpetual engagement with questions that matter. This perpetual quality is soothing in a way. It takes the pressure off. You do not have to solve the liar paradox. You do not have to arrive at the correct answer. You can simply appreciate it, engage with it, learn from it. The paradox is not a test you have to pass. It is an invitation to think, to wonder, to explore. And that invitation is always open. The paradox will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and 100 years from now. It is patient. It does not hurry. It simply waits, ready to engage with anyone who approaches it with curiosity and care. In the context of sleep, this patience is especially valuable. The mind preparing for rest does not need urgent problems or pressing demands. It needs gentle engagement, calm reflection, a soothing rhythm. The liar paradox, with its quiet loop and its endless oscillation, provides that. It is a thought that can be held lightly, turned over slowly, set down, and picked up again. There is no rush, there is no deadline. There is only the gentle movement of thought, tracing the same path over and over, finding a kind of peace in the repetition. The paradox also connects to the experience of falling asleep itself. Sleep is a kind of loop, a daily cycle of waking and sleeping, consciousness and unconsciousness. The mind winds down, thoughts slow, awareness fades, and then, after a period of rest, the mind winds back up. Thoughts resume, awareness returns. The cycle repeats, day after day, throughout a lifetime. It is a loop without a clear beginning or end, a pattern that continues as long as life continues. And within sleep, there are deeper loops. The stages of sleep cycle through the night, from light sleep to deep sleep to REM sleep and back again. Dreams arise, vivid and strange, and then fade as the sleeper shifts to a different stage. The mind in sleep is not shut off, but actively cycling through different states, different modes of being. And those cycles, like the logical loop of the liar paradox, do not have a simple resolution. They simply continue, unfolding according to their own rhythms. There is something fitting about contemplating the liar paradox as you drift towards sleep. Both involve loops, cycles, patterns that repeat. Both involve a kind of letting go, a release of the need for resolution. In sleep, You do not try to control your thoughts. You let them wander, let them fade, let them dissolve into the formless void of unconsciousness. And in contemplating the paradox, you let go of the need to solve it, to pin it down, to force it into a category. You simply let it be what it is, a loop, a cycle, a pattern that continues. The liar paradox, in the end, is a teacher. It teaches about language, about logic, about truth. It teaches about limits, about boundaries, about the edges of our conceptual frameworks. It teaches about self-reference, about recursion, about the strange loops that arise when systems fold back on themselves. And it teaches about acceptance, about humility, about the recognition that not everything can be controlled or resolved. These are valuable lessons, and they are lessons that do not need to be learned all at once. They can be absorbed slowly, over time, through repeated engagement with the paradox. Each encounter with the paradox reveals something new, or reinforces something already learned. The first time you meet it, you might be puzzled, disoriented, unsure what to make of it. The second time, you understand the structure better, see the loop more clearly. The third time, you appreciate the elegance, the simplicity, the power. With each return, the paradox becomes more familiar, more comfortable, more like an old friend. And that familiarity does not diminish its value. It deepens it. The paradox is not a one-time revelation. It is a companion for the journey, a presence that accompanies you through the landscape of thought. In the stillness of night, with the world quiet and the mind calm, the liar paradox offers a kind of gentle companionship. It does not demand anything. It does not insist on resolution. It simply presents itself over and over in its perfect paradoxical form. This statement is false. True implies false. False implies true. The loop continues, the oscillation persists, and there is a kind of peace in that persistence. It is a reminder that some things do not change, that some patterns endure, that some mysteries remain. And as the mind traces that loop, following the path from true to false and back again, thought slows, awareness softens, and the boundaries between waking and sleeping begin to blur. The paradox becomes a rhythm, a gentle pulse, a cycle that carries the mind toward rest. The loop does not end, but it does not need to end. It simply continues, as it always has, as it always will, a quiet presence in the landscape of thought, a companion on the journey toward sleep.